Hey everybody, and welcome back to our presentation applying the 7 steps of data analysis to produce a quantitative research study. William Bannon of Stats Whisperer here again, bringing you the final presentation. Okay, in this presentation, we're going to review the role and necessity of a standard model of data analysis in quantitative research, right? So standard model of data analysis, as we said before, are like our 7 steps model, right? So it's a model that shows each phase of a process, such as the 7 steps indicate each phase of the process of quantitative data analysis, right? Then we're going to discuss a couple of elephants in the room, which are generally regarded as challenges that are not really discussed much but are present seemingly most of the time. Then we'll end up with some concluding statements. Now, we want to keep in mind, right, as we go through this, keep in mind the challenges noted, the elephants are at a systemic level, right, not personal, right? So we're going to mention some challenges, but it's important to realize that these challenges are at the system level, right? So they concern more the point of evolution of the field of quantitative data analysis rather than anyone's personal responsibility, right? So I can attest firsthand from watching my colleagues that we're all doing our very, very best, working hard to teach quantitative research and to conduct and publish solid, interesting, creative, and contributive quantitative research studies. So as we go through this, please keep in mind what we're talking about is the point of evolution of the field of quantitative data analysis, right? So every field goes through different stages of evolution, which we'll discuss. So these challenges have to do with the way the system is set up right now, not the people in it necessarily. So the elephant in the room, right? So the future of a field often hinges on addressing the elephants in the room for that field, right? So fields go through stages of evolution, and there's often challenges, and the challenges may linger. They may linger for years upon years, if not decades. And then at some point, those challenges are addressed and the field progresses and matures. That's what we're going to discuss regarding the field of quantitative data analysis. So there'll be 2 elephants in the room that we need to address to better the future of quantitative research. Elephant 1 might be termed the fundamental failure to teach quantitative research effectively, where elephant 2 might be the fundamental unsoundness in published quantitative research today. So these are 2 big elephants. Okay, so now, taking the first one, the failure to teach quantitative research effectively. Now, there are a few beliefs that are ubiquitous among academic institutions. Okay, so as in teaching styles, one university might believe this is a better teaching style, another university considers something else as a better teaching style. There may be more hands-off, more applied, less hands-off, less applied. The ideologies really vary and differ. However, it is widely acknowledged that students find statistics classes confusing and not useful. Most of that is based upon the input of the students themselves, right? So after a statistics class, they'll be asked, right? Especially if it's a non-statistics program. They didn't enroll to learn statistics, right? And they're being taught statistics, and after the class, many times, you'll ask the students, can you do a quantitative research study? And they'll say they found the material a bit confusing, and they really have trouble actually applying the material to do a quantitative research study. So it's not useful, right? Now, a lot of institutions will tell you this has been the case for decades, in many departments in most, if not all, universities. So this is a real ubiquitous problem. And it's, as we said, it's widely acknowledged. So when students continually report finding quantitative research classes confusing and not useful, this is a bona fide crisis, right? This is a crisis level. However, if you look closely at a crisis, as we are with this magnifying glass, you'll see there's an opportunity within that crisis. And this is our potential point of evolution out of the crisis into a more mature quantitative data analysis research field. Now consider, why aren't there a great number of resources devoting to solving this systemic problem, right? The crisis where students are reporting, that they're not learning what they need to learn in these quantitative research classes, right? Now, institutions, right, schools, universities, educators, the professors, the instructors, and the students themselves invest a great deal of time, money, and effort in these classes, right? Think about all the money the university pays a professor to teach the class, all the money the student invests in tuition to take the class, right? All the time it takes to plan your syllabus, all the time it takes to study for midterms, right? It's a great deal of time, money, and effort, for sure. So we need to ask ourselves, is it ethical to devote all these resources to a system, right? That's what we said, it's a system level problem, to a system that continues to disappoint, right? So why would we keep devoting more and more, actually not the same amount, but more and more time, effort, and money into the system of learning quantitative data analysis when it's not yielding what we need it to yield? Now, there's a very cliche saying about insanity, right? That is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, right? So we need to ask ourselves, is that what we're doing with quantitative research, right? So it seems every semester we hear the same thing from students, that they find the classes confusing and they're not learning what they need to learn to actually do quantitative data analysis, right? So if that's been the pattern and it's been happening over and over again, it's probably not going to change unless the system changes, right? So you may consider it an ethical obligation and duty to find a teaching method that changes the system, right, that makes the teaching more effective and successful. Now, another thing to consider regarding the teaching of quantitative data analysis is, why is there such a wide variation in the way introductory materials are taught? Okay, so for example, in most programs such as accounting, law, and medicine, right, the introductory classes have the same subject matter. For example, if you took Introduction to Law, you would probably hear about Brown versus the Board of Education and other fundamental cases. Right? You would not present Brown versus the Board of Education and then have other instructors say, why would you teach that? That's not useful, right? Because they realize that's a fundamental case, right? That's fundamental material that needs to be presented and understood if you're going to have a competent introduction to the subject of law. Right? So there are acknowledged fundamentals that should be included within these introductory classes. But often, introduction to quantitative research classes, right, are entirely at the discretion of the instructor, which could be good, right? But it could also, have effects that are not desired, right? So since it's at the discretion of the instructor and there's no acknowledged model, right? There's no acknowledged model that incorporates all the fundamentals that need to be presented, these classes are often taught in hugely varying ways. For example, I've seen classes where it generally concerns teaching how to compute a t-test or chi-square by hand, and that's the introductory to statistics, right? Or the introductory to quantitative data analysis, right? Which, as we saw in our presentation, is just a very small part of step 5. So you're not learning the overall process, you're learning how to manually do a couple of tests in step 5. So that's not really an introduction to quantitative data analysis, just an introduction to a small piece of it, right? Another class, right, may instruct students to open SPSS and practice some tests and analysis, which may be guided or not guided by the instructor. So the methods used to teach quantitative data analysis really vary. And that differs from the way other subjects are introduced. So if performing quantitative research is a skill, shouldn't there be agreed upon fundamentals taught, just like there's agreed upon fundamentals in presenting law, right, or medicine? You can go to medicine and they'll introduce, each organ and the purpose of it. You wouldn't go to the introduction to medicine and they just present a kidney, right, or a kidney and a gallbladder, and that's all introduction to medicine is about. No, because medicine concerns the whole body, so you need to see the whole, right? So when we look at quantitative data analysis, we need to see the whole process from beginning to end, from research question to writing up the findings, right? So just looking at a t-test or a chi-square is like looking at just the heart, or just the heart and the kidney, or just a small part, and that's not an introduction to the overall topic. Right? So shouldn't there be agreed upon subject matter to learn, right? So if we care about teaching it, shouldn't we be sure that these essentials are systematically presented in every introduction to quantitative research class taught, right? Just like the human body. We want to make sure the entire topic is covered overall. Right? So that's what we're saying about the point of evolution, right? There was probably a point of evolution in medicine where they just looked at one organ or two organs, and then somebody said, we should be looking at the whole body in our introduction classes. And then they changed it systematically to look at the whole body. So that's what we're suggesting with quantitative data analysis, to change it from looking at little pieces to looking at the overall whole. So a standard model of data analysis, right, would be an effective teaching tool because students can grasp the fundamental process of data analysis immediately, right? So they see that overall, it's just like the human body, they see the overall function, right? And then when they learn specifics, like maybe after the introduction to the human body, you take a class on the heart, right? So the same thing with quantitative data analysis. After you learn the whole process, maybe you'll take a class that's specifically on linear regression, right? Then you get specialized, right? But all the subsequent learning would inform their knowledge of this overall process or topic, right? It would be a way to assure that the fundamentals are taught. So if we had a model that said, this is the model of data analysis, these are the fundamentals that are interlocking and connecting to perform the process of data analysis, and it's mapped out, well, then if that was taught, we would be sure the fundamentals were all being presented, right? The model could be a way of standardizing the introduction to quantitative data analysis courses to deliver all the necessary information instead of the way it's widely taught now at the discretion of the professor, which may or may not incorporate one or all of these essentials. Now, elephant number 2, the unsound published research, right? So that is another big topic. So we all, just assuming here, okay, so just bear with me, we all like to read published quantitative research, right? I know that's a big assumption on my behalf, right? And regard the findings with credibility, right? We don't like to read it and say, oh, well, if that was true, that would be nice. we like to read it and say, oh, that's an interesting study, and regard it as valid, right? I mean, truly, this is our source of knowledge, right? So we make decisions in care, we make policy decisions, we make intervention decisions. It's the best form of information to base our decisions on, published quantitative research studies, right? Now, here's the challenge, and this is why it's such an elephant in the room, right? If you apply the standards of a Research 101 course, you can't regard the findings of most studies as sound, right? So that's a big challenge, because if all you have to work with are these studies, and these studies aren't sound, then you don't have anything to work with, right? So that's our big challenge here. Now, why is this? So, the Research 101 course, for example, as we said many times, says you need checks of test assumptions to produce accurate findings. And this is no big secret, and it's not argued about. This is what you learn when you take Research 101, right? That you need to look at these test assumptions, and if you don't look, as we've demonstrated with outliers and so on, if they're not examined, the findings can be inaccurate very easily, right? However, if you look at most published studies, these checks are not reported, right? So essentially, since they're not reported, we can't be sure these studies are sound, right? But most of the time we like to act as if they are, because we have nothing else to base our decisions upon, right? So we need something, and this is the best source. But the best source is flawed, because the fundamental soundness of each study has not been met, right, most often. So if you read, even in the New England Journal of Medicine and the best peer-reviewed journals out there, if you read a quantitative research study, you'll find that many of the dimensions that we've looked at in the 7 steps of data analysis and test assumptions are not even mentioned, right? And they could be mentioned very briefly, just so we know that they were considered and what was done if there was a problem or if there wasn't a problem. But if they're not mentioned at all, we can't be sure what was done, right? And we shouldn't cite a study if we're not sure if it's sound or not. And that's the problem, that's the elephant. Right? Now, many people will say, the checks, these checks of data integrity and all these other things must have been done. They're not just reported in the article. Perhaps there was a limitation of words and they couldn't fit the reporting in there, right? So they say it must have been done, right? But that's not right? That's not a legitimate or acceptable argument in any way, shape, or form, right? As we saw when we looked at our checks of data integrity, there are many potential problems that come up, and there are several ways to deal with those problems. Some of the ways are more valid than others, and depending on your ideology, you might not agree with the way one thing was handled, and you might not believe the findings of the study based upon that. But you can't make that decision unless you were informed on what the problem was and how it was handled. For example, we addressed there's many ways to deal with missing data, from overly simple, such as just using the mean, all right, for income. So if an income, remember the income example? If your income is missing, right, we said you're probably more likely to have a lower or higher income, but many people use the mean of the valid reported incomes of other study participants to create a value for the missing value. And we showed how that was very dangerous and that skews findings, right? And we also talked about multiple imputation, right, which is more sophisticated. But if a study doesn't tell us how much missing data there were or were not, and if they use mean imputation or multiple imputation, we can't be sure what was done. Okay? So to regard the study as legitimate, we need to know the problem and how it was handled. And most studies, even like I said, even in the best peer-reviewed journals, do not mention that. And you'll see it's inconsistently mentioned across studies. One study will mention it, the other study won't. Well, if one study mentions it and it's needed, then why do we accept the fact that it's not presented in the next study, which also needs it, right? This is what we call the lack of evolution, right, in a professional field. Many studies also do not have an adequate sample size, right? In other words, they don't have enough statistical power to really test their hypotheses or their research questions. But a lot of the studies seem to not realize that statistical power actually exists, right? That perhaps they didn't pick up the relationship because they lack statistical power due to a smaller sample, right? But those studies are often published, and other people read them and regard them as valid, not realizing the findings may be related not to the variable relationships, but statistical power. And many studies don't report the 3 dimensions, right, of our data analysis, the univariate, bivariate, and multivariate, which we saw each dimension is an important consideration in how we examine the data. So a standard model of data analysis would be effective in assuring the fundamentals are followed in professional research. So it would be our way of saying, right, to the field of quantitative data analysis, these are the fundamental steps that need to be followed when doing a quantitative research study, right? And as a team, as a whole, as a family, we could approach it in that manner, right? Readers, editors, and researchers can acknowledge a recognized standard, right? Standardized method of producing legitimate research. And that's another point, is editors and peer reviewers, right? So they don't have a standard to follow right now. They don't have a standard to apply every research article they review to. So they're not sure, right? Just like assessing the published study. They're not sure what should be there, perhaps, before they read the article. And what is there might sound good, but they don't have a standard to realize what's missing and not missing. So it's like we said, it's not at the personal level, it's at the system level. So also, this is very important, a model, right? So the model is going to introduce the fundamentals, immediately. So the model will allow early researchers to progress to an experience level instead of years of trial and error, right? So, for example, what I did was send my work into the peer reviewers, and many peer reviewers, are very, very intelligent, and they don't mind contributing, to early researchers, and they'll say, you forgot to do X, Y, Z, which I didn't forget to do, I wouldn't have known, right? So I said, oh, okay, so I'll implement that in my process, right? So years and years after leaving things out, right, I finally got a sense of what should be there, right? So you could even see that in the earlier publication that I had, that we dissected in looking at our qualitative paper, right? There's varying levels of efficiency. Like I left out a bunch of important things in that first paper, and in later papers, they're included, right? So this could be avoided if there was a standard model to follow, right? So an early researcher could be told immediately, these are the points you need to follow to do a comprehensive, legitimate study. And like it says here, when you know better, you do better. So I'm just like everybody else. The best I know how to do is what I do. So if there was a standard model that I could have followed back then, I would have followed it. So, concluding statements. So, established fields, when you think about it, have standard reference points to follow, right? For example, we talked about a surgeon performing surgery earlier, right? So, there was probably a time in the field of medicine when surgery just started where all surgeons did the best they knew how, right, regarding surgery, right? In other words, there weren't clearly identified steps, like wash your hands, prepare the patient, right? There weren't clearly identified steps that each surgeon was expected to follow. They just did the best they knew how with what they knew. And that's a very good description of quantitative data analysis now. So quantitative data analysis is at that point surgery was at however many hundreds of years ago. Right? So you can see the bird here now of fledgling, right? Fledgling is somebody who's new at something, but it actually refers to a young bird, a bird that's just born. So the absence of the model of data analysis reflects the fledgling nature of quantitative analysis. So at this point, if somebody were to perform surgery and not follow the steps, that would be considered ridiculous. Of course, there's steps to an important procedure like surgery that have to be acknowledged and followed. Well, someday they'll say the same thing about quantitative data analysis. They'll say, you know what, yeah, for quantitative data analysis, the process, you have to follow these steps. And it'll seem ridiculous that at one point in the evolution of quantitative data analysis, people, just like surgery, people are doing the best they know how with what they've got, but there's not a universally recognized standard, just like the surgical procedure has now. There's not a universally recognized standard for how things should be done. Okay, exciting times and opportunities, right? So our standard would provide our needed reference point, right? So how many generations, right? So once we develop this and hone this standard model, how many generations after will benefit from it, right? So we'll recognize it, use it, and benefit from it and progress more quickly. Specifically, the specification of this model might be the richest contribution we can make to the future generations of quantitative data analysis researchers right now. Thus, in our presentation, that's what we've considered, right? We've submitted and considered the 7 steps of data analysis as a standard model of data analysis to meet this need. So again, if you have a problem and you can't find the A-team, visit us. Right, that was on the first slide. Visit us at www.statswhisper.com. See our archived newsletters and so on, which are available for free. And so we're wishing you the best, prosperous, and most fulfilling research career possible. All right, thank you for attending the program.